Hotep. Giving honor and respect to the one source, to the ancestors for their divine contribution, to those elders who continue to advance our cause, and to those young activists and revolutionaries who are few but who learn from the ancestors and the elders and who continue to advance our cause. Thank you all for coming out this beautiful Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon here in Oakland. And our topic today is the history of the kingdom of Kush and the first Kushite dynasty. The history of the kingdom of Kush and the first Kushite dynasty. So I want to talk about the achievements, the accomplishments, the importance of the Kushite empire and its extent, because it was a vast empire. But before I talk about the subject, I want to mention that we don't have flyers today, but we'll have them in the mail. So make sure that each of you sign the mailing list. We're having our second 6-week seminar. We had the first 6-week seminar in February and March. We had a good turnout. And some of the people here today were at the seminar. We had some informed brothers and sisters, and we had a good session. And that first seminar was on ancient Kemet and community development. So we try to connect the research on classical African culture and community development. So this is a second 6-week seminar, which begins July 27th through, I think it is August, the end of August. And it's every Monday night from 7:30 to 9:30. So if you count 6 weeks from July 27th, we'll be meeting right here at Wosei. So it's 6 weeks each Monday night. And you can see myself or any of the ministers at Wosei to sign up for the course. And we think it's a minimal fee as well. So we can, if you have questions, we can talk about the seminar, which begins in a few weeks. And before I also start, I wanted to say that this weekend I went to a family wedding in a place called, what was that at? Walnut Creek, Clayton, Concord. And Martinez, people from those regions where my cousin got married. And I must say that I was in Europe for many months. I traveled the breadth of Western Europe, and I saw a lot. And as you could imagine, there's not too many Africans in Europe. Even in the most heavily concentrated country where there are Africans, which is Britain, there's only 1% Africans. And the situation is appalling in terms of the level of consciousness of most of our people. It's as if the mind is gone, and the commitment to community is gone. The commitment to maintain the melanin in the family and in the tradition is gone. And I was reminded of that this weekend, that right here in the Bay Area we have equally tragic conditions. And one of the things that struck me most about Europe was the interracial relationships. And that struck me, and in fact it struck the people that I was with probably more than anything else as well. So when I came back, I was expecting our people to be a little bit more clear. And some of us are, obviously us in the room are. But to my knowledge, San Francisco is probably the only city in this country which has a declining African population over the past decade. That's unique in America. Urban centers in this country are becoming more and more African, as most of us know. So what's happening is that many people that I went to school with, they're moving to Burlingame, they're moving to Vallejo, they're moving to Concord. And they're in these places without any notion of what it means to be an African. And I was struck by that this weekend. It was appalling. And many of the brothers that I went to school with and hung out with, all of them have either married outside of the race or had babies outside of the race or are tipping around when the candles are out. So we got a situation where we need to come back home. And I would posit that one of the main things that African historians are trying to do right now, one of the main contributions that we're trying to make is to reconstitute the African memory. And when we study our historical tradition and accomplishments, we're trying to do three things. First of all, answer three main questions. Number one, who am I? Number two, where am I? And three, what time is it? Those are the questions that we want to ask in our historical studies. And I was struck by the situation, and I'm hoping that some of those Africans who are crossing over this weekend will come back home. So the history of the kingdom of Kush. I wanted to speak on this because one of the other great contributions that African scholars can make in this era is to have our people to go into the next century with our history intact, with our memory intact. One of the problems that we have is that we do not have a whole memory. And Chancellor Williams is quite correct when he talks about the fact that African civilization is so old that you can't even put a Stone Age date on it. But yet most of us do not know that story. And our history reads as a novel. So in order to understand essentially who we are and where we need to go, we really have to understand the wholeness of our experience. Understand it as a story, understand it as a novel. And in our movement, the African-centered movement or the Afrocentric movement, we are having an impact. We're having an impact because we're taking back the pyramids and we're taking back the Nile Valley. We're taking back the Hamites and whoever else we need to take back to reclaim our tradition. And we're having an impact because throughout the Western world now, the European museums, institutes, and researchers, they are putting together Nubian and Kushite exhibits, permanent exhibits, throughout the West. In the British Museum, there's a new Kushite exhibit. In the Oriental Institute in Chicago, there's a new exhibit. In the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, there is a new exhibit. At the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, there's a new exhibit. There's a permanent exhibit in Warsaw, Poland, which has been there for many years, and there's also one in Brussels. And this basically is a response to our movement. And the Boston Museum of Fine Arts states that outright, that in fact, the new Nubian Kushite exhibit at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the artifacts on display are not new. They've had them for decades, but they've put them on display as a response to our movement. So what we're doing now is reclaiming the lower Nile Valley. That's what we're concentrating our work on right now. So they are a step ahead. They say, well, we will give you an interpretation of Nubia. We will give you our interpretation of Kush. And they've given us an interpretation. And I talked to I suppose he's a researcher in New York, and he gave me what he thought was the political history of Nubia and Kemet. And every person that he mentioned, every researcher, every archaeologist he mentioned were European researchers. And he only mentioned them to show me that he knows a lot about the field. So instead of arguing details with him, I suggested to him that all of what we know basically, well, what he was expressing more particularly, is based on their archaeological work and their translation of ancient text. But he apparently is not concerned at this point of going to the records himself, of going to the documents himself. So he wanted to impress me with his knowledge of European researchers and not understanding that these things have been put together and are being put together for our consumption so that we won't understand the correct history. So he thinks, for example, that there's always been an antagonistic relationship between Nubia in the south and Kemet in the north. He doesn't think that there was ever any unity. He's going on their data, their research. So that's why we express primary research. So I want to today is to go through as I said, the extent of the Kushite Empire, to talk about it in other traditions, the references to Kush, and show some slides as well. Not too many slides because we have a lot of slides that we could show, but we don't want to dominate the time. And one of the things that many of you know is that what we push is a workshop model and not a lecture model. So more and more, as this year comes to a close, we will have it more and more as a workshop so that you will know in advance not only what the topics are, but what angle we intend to take on the topics. And we will ask you to either come to WOSE, or if you have the material, to prepare by coming. And I would simply be the facilitator. And that's what we mean by connecting the research to community development, because we do not like to have people sitting in the audience with hands in lap. That's not an African model. But the kingdom of Kush, it is mentioned in the biblical tradition. And there's a good article by Charles Cofer in the Journal of African Civilization. I think it's a Nile Valley issue. And he talks about the references to Kemet, so-called Egypt, and Kush in the journals. And Kush is mentioned 58 times in the Bible. And of course, they're negative references to Kush. And so when we get these references of Kush, Kush is not in power at that time. But Kush was such a powerful kingdom, such a powerful empire that its legend continued long after Kush remained a powerful civilization. And not only was it called Kush in the biblical tradition, it was called Kush in the tradition of ancient Kemet. So in the Medu Neter, it is also called Kush, the kingdom of Kush. And this is, in fact, the kingdom of Kush and the kingdom of Punt, as many of you probably know. But researchers think that Punt was in this region of Somalia today. So the people of Kemet made almost exclusive reference to the South. When they were talking about their political history and their religious, spiritual history, they talked about the South. They talked about Kush and they talked about Punt because that's where they came from. That was the land of the deities, the Ta Neter, the land of the gods, is what they often talked about. So they talked very much about the kingdom of Kush. In fact, it was the Kushites who said that everything of significance in Kemet has come from us. They've mentioned that. They said that the priesthood, they told the Greeks, many of the Greek writers report, and Latin writers report, that the Kushites are very clear that not only did they give the priesthood to Kemet, they gave the laws to Kemet. They in fact peopled Kemet. They even the land, the soil in the south went from the Kushite kingdom, the heart of the Kushite kingdom in the upper Nile Valley. And of course, this is up. This is a mountainous region here. So the river actually flows from south to north. So in this region is where the Kushites would be. And so when people talk about the kingdom of Kush, they're basically the Latin writers, biblical writers. They're talking about those lands south of Kemet, number one. And they're also talking about across the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. So all of this would be considered the kingdom of Kush, as well as all the way in the east in India. So many writers, when they talk about Kush, they're not only talking about modern-day Ethiopia. They're talking about that whole region. They're talking about across the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia and even east. They're talking about the kingdom of Kush because it was Kushites who went to these lands and created high culture. It was the Kushites who were said to be the most just of men. They were the blameless Ethiopians, according to Homer. And Homer, the first European on record as writing, talks about the blameless Ethiopians and the Greeks' chief god Zeus and other gods going to feast with the Ethiopians at religious and sacred ceremonies, so that they had to leave the country in order to seek spirituality from the people who gave them what they got. And I'm not calling what they got civilization, because we don't equate civilization with writing in cities, but it has to do with how people relate to one another. It has to do with human relationships. So the kingdom of Kush had a great legend because of its great spirituality. They had what is called, in terms of this blamelessness, they had what they called the table of the sun. And Herodotus reports that. He reports on the table of the sun in his book, The Histories, which is very easy to get. This is a very thorough document because Herodotus, being one of the earliest, if not the earliest European historian, was very careful. He weighed evidence very carefully. And when he did not have a chance to verify things, he would note that he didn't have a chance to verify whether or not the stories told to him were true or not, because he traveled to the great land of the Nile Valley to seek knowledge of sources. And he reports that the king of Persia, Cambyses, this was around 450 or so before the Christian era, or BC, and Cambyses sent spies. He sent a couple of brothers to go spy on his own people, on the Kushites, because the Cambyses wanted to know more about the Kushite Empire, wanted to know what they ate. He wanted to know why were these people considered the tallest and the best looking people in the world. And he also wanted to know about this table of the sun. And the table of the sun was basically every night you would have people in the kingdom who would bring out boiled meat and drink for all who wanted to drink in the morning. It was for everybody. There was no poverty in Ethiopia. This was not only for the indigenous population, but it was also for travelers. So it was this table of the sun which typifies the Ethiopian spirit, this great spirituality which was expressed by the Ethiopians. And then even after all of these many thousands of years, the Ethiopians were still respected as a great spiritual nation. And one of the other things that Herodotus reports, I'll just read this very quickly. But he asked, the Persian Cambyses asked the spies to find out how long did the Ethiopians live. They said that we live on average 120 years, and sometimes older. And so the Persians were very surprised by that. And the Ethiopians said that we're not surprised because you eat dung. And because you eat dung, you cannot live as long as the long-lived Ethiopians, who were considered the best-looking people in the world. But also, the Ethiopians understood that the Persians were sending their brothers as spies. So they were very careful about the kind of information that they gave them. And the Ethiopian king at that time told the spies to tell Cambyses and the Persians that be glad that we are a just people, that we do not go and to take lands from other people. And you come back to our land when you're able to pull a bow this size. So they unstrung the bow and gave it to the spies and said, take this back to Cambyses and tell him that he better be glad that the Ethiopian are just people, that we do not go and to take lands and to kill people. But this legend of Ethiopia as a just place is the basic foundation of the Kushite kingdom. It is the basis, it is the foundation. So not only the priesthood, as I was saying, but the burial practices, the rite of mummification, all of these things came from Kush, came from the kingdom of Kush, and they gave this to his older daughter, his oldest daughter, which was Kemet. All of these things came directly from Kush itself. And this book here, written in 1926 by Drusilla Houston, the wonderful Ethiopians of the ancient Kushite Empire, is the most comprehensive study, is the most comprehensive account of the Ethiopian Empire, the Kushite Empire. And although there are other works, there's more details and things that have come out since 1926, she has the most comprehensive view of the extent of the empire, because you have great historians like Chancellor Williams, who talks about, and I'm going to show slides of the Kushite Empire in Africa that Chancellor Williams has a map of. But Chancellor Williams basically talks about the great Kushite Empire on the continent. He doesn't talk about it in Mesopotamia. He doesn't talk about it in Saudi Arabia or in India. But Drusilla Houston talked about the extent of the empire all the way in the east. So this is one of the most important books. And believe me, if you do not have this book, please run to Marcus, run to JR Books, run to any place where you can get this book, because in years to come, this will be a classic. The author is Drusilla Houston. And this is a sister who put this book together with no research assistants, no team of graduate students to help her, no computers available for a literature search. She was not even in the research centers of the country. She was in a lowly place at that time called Oklahoma. And yet she pulled together, well, at that time it was. Well, from a researcher's point of view, there was not a lot of records there. And yet she was able to pull together a massive array of data. And while we may look at the details differently, her comprehensive view of the Kushite kingdom is exact in terms of its extent. And you know that not only do we have the account of Drusilla Houston, but also in that same biblical account, many of you are probably aware that in the chapter 10 of Genesis, there's a table of races. And in chapter 10, it is talked about who is the descendant of whom. And Noah, according to the biblical tradition, had 3 sons who were Shem, you all don't know, Japheth, and Ham. And Ham is considered to be the progenitor of black people. And Ham's 4 sons were Mizraim, which is Kemet, Punt, which is, as I mentioned, Somalia, Canaan, and also Kush. So they're saying that these people, that the Kushites, the people in Kemet, that the original people in Canaan, who were the Sumerians, that these were, and the people of Punt, that these were black people. And the Bible also tells us in chapter 10 of Genesis that Kush was the father of Nimrod. And Nimrod was the creator of what they call in the Bible the Babylonian history or tradition. So it is saying that the Kushite civilization is older than civilization in Mesopotamia. That's what it's saying. There's a lot of evidence and documentation about this kingdom. And the reason why this is important to talk about the kingdom of Kush, because this is a 1926 account, and I think it is the best account. And we're almost in the 21st century, and I think that we could add to this, because she didn't have the kind of data that we have available now, and we do have to put together the wholeness of our experience so that we can understand that we too are Kushites, that we too are the blameless Ethiopians. And the reason why this is even more important is that the suppression of truth, the hiding of facts, have allowed the destruction of the Ethiopians. It has allowed the destruction of the Kushites. Look at the situation in Mozambique today. Look at the situation in the Sudan, in Chad, in Ethiopia itself. It is tragic. And so the people who are the direct descendants of the Kushites today are suffering because of the fact that we've lost our memory. It has been erased from the historical record. And you can read multi-volume accounts about the history of the Nile Valley and read perhaps a couple of paragraphs about Kush. And the disrespect is so blatant that they don't even identify them with a culture, a land base, or with any respect. So the Kushite kingdoms and empires are called the A group, or the C group, or the X group. We don't even get the respect from the European archaeologists to be identified with anything concrete, but only identified with an alphabetic letter. And you find that that's the standard, the A group, the C group, the X group. And they thought it was a B group, but then they found out that it wasn't a B group. The B group was really part of the A group, but the whole discussion is criminal. But I want to talk about the extent of the empire, and I want to talk about it in Kemet, and Sumer, or Mesopotamia, in India, Arabia, and ancient America. Now, one of the things that is happening today, and some of you are probably familiar with this, is that whenever the space shuttle goes up, and the first time it was done was in 1981, the space shuttle went up, and when the space shuttle goes up, it takes aerial photographs. It takes images that penetrate beneath the surface. So it has the subterranean penetrating rays. So when they shoot these images, they're called satellite imaging radars, or SEER. And they've shot these things across Africa in 3 different places. And so when you look at these tapes, and I've seen them, I was working with a brother who works with NASA. He has the original photographs themselves. You can tell when there is a depression. And if there is a depression, it probably means that it's a burial site. And if it's a burial site, it is an ancient site where African people were. And archaeologists now know. Now, there's SEER A and SEER B that I was working with the brother. And they basically, SEER B would cross Kemet here and go across the continent. So if we examine this area here, we would see different structures below the surface. And we would just have to identify those structures and find out exactly where they are on the continent. And if we know that, we can identify where they are ancient remains. So SEER B would cross here, and SEER A kind of crosses over B, so you have A going kind of in that direction. And what archaeologists have done is that they have excavated in the in the Sahara area and have found ancient stone tools. Because they were able to understand through these satellite imaging radars that these were ancient sites where Africans had settlements. So there was an ancient river system. We know of the Sahara as a dry place today, as a desert. But in olden times, this was a very pluvial area. It was an area that was very humid and very moist. It's not speculation, it is unmistakable fact. And so, for example, the archaeologists have used these images and have found that the history of the Sahara goes back for settlement. Documented settlement goes back at least 300,000 years, because there have been many stone tools that have been found. And this culture is called the Acheulean culture. The Acheulean culture, they found dates dating back 300,000 years. Another absolute date is 212,000 years, 141,000 years ago, 45,000 years ago, and 15,000 years ago. These were the dates where there was definitely settlement in the Nile Valley. This is very important for us because we want to understand the fullness of our experience. If we could go back and say that we know that in this region that there was a settlement, we can go and investigate. We have these satellite imaging radars to draw on as data. There's ancient maps, and also there's mounds throughout the Nile Valley, little mounds, hills, and throughout Africa. And in the Nile Valley, they are called Tel. It could be Tel El Amarna, for example. That was the region where Akhenaten, or Amenhotep IV, located his government. So any place that you have Tel El Amarna or Tel, it means mound in Arabic, or Kom means mound in Arabic, K-O-M. So there's places like Komombo, for example. These are places that there were ancient mounds, and under those mounds were cities. Under those mounds were cities, and we can find out where these are by going by place names, like as I said, Tel or Kom, looking at the satellite imaging radars and so forth. And many of you, if you were looking at the paper, I would say 2 or 3 months ago, you would have heard that the city of Uber, the great trading city of Uber, just across the Red Sea from, and this was in the ancient Ethiopian Empire, that the city of Uber was found by looking at these satellite imaging radars and by ancient maps. And without these radars, they would not have found the city of Uber as quickly as they did. But they were studying the maps and studying the satellite imaging radars to detect this. The same thing can be done for the continent. And the reason why this is important to look at the fullness of our experience is because we are bound by chronology that has been put together by those who have a political, not a scholarly agenda. For example, we are bound by biblical chronology. Somebody has told us that the world was created 6,000 years ago. So if the world was created 6,000 years ago, that means that civilization would have to be quite young. But we know that that's certainly not the case, because I want to show you a particular slide later, but that Kemet was the offspring of Kush. And according to Kemet records, the royal papyrus of Turin, and they call it Turin, the Turin papyrus because it's in the city of Turin now, in the museum there. And according to that papyrus, there was a period of 36,000 years before the first dynasty. And this is an original Kemetan document. Why has that been dismissed? Why has that been ignored? Because it might raise questions that if Kemet is not as young as you have said, and did not come from Mesopotamian culture as you have said, then maybe it's come from a different region. Maybe it came from the kingdom of Kush, and it did. And later you have other accounts. You have Manetho, who was a priest in Kemet, who gave an account of the history. When the Greeks invaded, they asked Manetho to give us the history of your country. And Manetho, being a priest who was able to read the documents, put together the history of Kemet in the Greek language. And according to Manetho, the chronology goes back almost 25,000 years. So here we have two authentic Kemetan records that have been ignored by researchers for no good reason. They are political reasons. But if these questions are raised, then maybe some of these settlements in the ancient Sahara would then make sense. That you would have settlements 300,000 years ago, 212,000 years ago, 141,000 years ago, because we know that not only people were around many thousands of years before what they've told us, but also they were building high culture. They were building high culture. And so I'm going to read this from a excerpt from her book before I talk about a little bit more about the kingdom of Kush. And I do want to emphasize some more elements of the kingdom of Kush and where it spread. But this is for you. This is what she's writing, because this is in her introduction. And Drusilla Houston said, "Lift up your heads, discouraged and downtrodden Ethiopians. Listen to this marvelous story told of your ancestors, who wrought mightily for mankind and built the foundations of civilization, true and square in the days of old. Awake, ye Aryans, become aware of the acute need of the world today of this enchanted energy and ability. The absence of this power is the cause of many a breakdown in modern civilization. Out of our own accepted sciences, the chapters of this book prove the Kushite race to be the fountainhead of civilization. If you desire truth, if you desire to be fair-minded, to be educated in the vital knowledge not possessed by the average college student, if you desire to be an authority upon the life of the ancients," she says, "go down with me as archaeology, ethnology, geography, and philology disclose, not in a dry and tedious way, but through the unfolding of this, the most intensely interesting and startling drama of the ages. The Kushite race, its institutions, customs, laws, and ideas were the foundation upon which our modern culture was laid." Now that's an African with a clear mind, with a free mind. That's African clear vision, because she's absolutely correct, even though she wrote so long ago. So that's why we honor this Drusilla Dunjee Houston. As I mentioned, the Kushites had a great tradition. This lived on among the Greeks, among the people in Kemet, and they always talked about these wonderful Ethiopians. But we can look at, and I'll just read a couple of names here. You can look again at the book by Herodotus, because he was, again, a careful researcher. And he talks about that he makes really no separation between the people in Kemet and those in Ethiopia, or Kush. He says that they're the same people, and they have practiced circumcision since the time immemorial. We don't know when it began. But this is an African custom, circumcision, which I think you all know what that is. But Herodotus, he writes that. You have Strabo, who also was a writer during the time of Christ. And Strabo talks about that the Egyptians settled the Egyptians settled in the Koki, in the Koki around the Black Sea area. So we don't really have it on this map, but he's talking about, okay, here, the Black Sea area, that the people in Kemet who were influenced by the Kushite migrated north around the Black Sea, and Herodotus is saying that the people in Koki are, he says, Kemetans or Egyptians because they had black skin and woolly hair. He says that does not amount to much, since there were so many other nations with black skin and woolly hair, but also because they practiced circumcision. So he says that this was a part of Kemet. But Diodorus probably has even more interesting information. Diodorus of Sicily, which is in Italy, around the time of Christ, he says that, and this is what I was mentioning in passing earlier, he was told by the Ethiopians. The Ethiopians, or we would say also the Kushites, say that the Egyptians are one of their colonies, which was led into Egypt by Osiris, or Osar. They claimed that at the beginning of the world, Egypt was simply a sea, but that the Nile, carrying down vast quantities of soil from Ethiopia in its floodwaters, finally filled it and made Egypt a part of the continent. The Ethiopians add that the Egyptians received from them the greater part of their laws. It is from them that the Egyptians have learned to honor the kings and gods, to bury them with such pomp. Sculpture and writings were also invented by the Ethiopians. And Herodotus accounts, and other Greek and Roman writers account that it is and we know We don't have to get it from them, but the Africans deify their kings. So I'm going to show you that in the slides. But they deify the kings. So the guys that you have in Egypt were actual kings in Ethiopia. About the time they got to Egypt, they were deified. As we lift up our ancestors, so did the people in the Kushite Empire. They practiced burial. They didn't burn people. They didn't carry people around in urns. You know, when you're a nomadic people, you have small things that you carry with you, which are the ancestors' remains. But that's only if you're nomadic. You have to burn them in order to keep your ancestors with you. But if you're an agricultural society, which is a Kushite trait, then you have burial practices. You practice agriculture. Also, the people in Kush, in the Kushite kingdom, said that they were the ones who gave the people in Kemet their knowledge of how to shape statues. They also said that they gave them their writing system, which they did. It is universally agreed that there's different scripts in the hieroglyphs, but basically you can reduce them to two. You can say that there's the pictograms or the pictures, which people call the hieroglyphs, and there's like the cursive form, which is called hieratic, and there's another form of the cursive, which is demotic. And it's like our printing and cursive. But basically the demotic is unmistakably it's not denied by anybody that it came from the Kushites, that they introduced the demotic script in the 25th dynasty. But we also know, and the Ethiopians tell us, that they also introduced the other scripts. They also introduced the cleanliness of the priesthood, that you can't go in the temples unclean, that you have to bathe 2 times in the day, 2 times in the evening. You have to stay shaven so that you are clean, that you go into the temples as a clean person. The Ethiopians say that they gave the priesthood's dress to the people in Kemet. The way that they dressed came from Kemet. The staff of the pharaohs came from the Kushites to the people in Kemet, and they also say that they gave them the crown as well. And if you look at the artifacts, there's no distinction at all. There's no distinction whatsoever between the kingdom of Kush in ancient times and Kemet. It is only, and I have to explain it more on the slide so you can see the diagram, but it is only because of political reasons that you begin to get differences in the culture. But in ancient times, there was no distinction whatsoever in the pottery, the statues, the writing, and the people themselves. There was no difference, there was no separation at all between the people in Kush and the people in Kemet. And there's other things that the Greeks have said, but that's just one line of evidence to talk about the Ethiopian Empire. But I also want to say too, because what I want to do is to talk about, I'm going to say something about Kemet first, and I want to come back to Kemet in the slides, because I do want to focus on the first dynasty in Kemet. And I think that's important. And so just keep in mind that it is a Kushite trait, agriculture, which they gave to the world as a contribution. And also, not only did they give agriculture, but social organization itself, the way that they organize society, the way that they prioritize the female is a Kushite trait. It is a trait that Diop has written about, and other people have written about as a trait of the Sun people. You heard that term before, I'm sure. But the Sun people, we're really talking about the people in Kush. So we think that the kingdom of Kush goes back, I gave you dates of when the people in Kemet said that their history goes back. The kingdom of Kush is older than that. And we know that it's a lot older. And one of the things which begins to document this is recently, researchers have found that agriculture began 3 times earlier than what they've said. They told us that, well, you know, agriculture began maybe 7,000 years ago. But researchers have been able to document, for example, Fred Windorf, who has really dominated archaeology in the Nile Valley. Fred Windorf has documented that the Africans had domesticated plants at least between 17,000 and 18,000 years ago. That's according to what they found so far. And that's without even doing any kind of real archaeological work. And the reason why we don't know more about Kush is because the people who do research do not think that it is worth their time to go further south than Kemet, to go into this region here and do any research. And when I was in London, I asked one of the archaeologists, why don't you all do research south of Kemet? She said, well, we don't do research south of Kemet because that's an entirely different part of the world. It has no connection to northern Africa, so that's why we don't. And I'm saying that because what has happened is that not only has the archaeological work been scanty, but also the physical evidence itself has been removed. You've had a series of dams. The Aswan Dam, the first one around 1896 was built. And Aswan is around now, it was one of the ancient borders, but Aswan would be around here now. If you can see this is a vast lake. This is Lake Nasser, and Aswan is just above that. And that lake has been created with the creation of the Aswan Dam, and it has covered up more African history than we care to imagine. So we will never see the mummies, because one thing that keeps mummies preserved, is their dryness. And you won't see the artifacts because they're under the lake now, and that is a vast lake. So the physical evidence has been destroyed. And there was no archaeological work done in 1896 when they first built the Aswan Dam, and they've subsequently raised it many times. 1902 they raised it, 1934 they raised it again, and the latest Aswan High Dam was built in 1960, from 1960 to 70, and in building that, they destroyed any other evidence that they needed to destroy. And they did save a few Nubian Kushite temples, but those temples are not in Kemet now. They're in America and Europe. So whole sacred sites, whole religious sites have been taken from Nubia, and the Egyptian government, the people who now are there as a gesture of our hospitality, because we are the original owners of that land, so they're there because we're being very hospitable to them. But they've given away our temples. They're now in New York at the Metropolitan Museum. They're in Holland, they're in Germany, they're in Spain, and they gave these temples away. But this is the removing of the physical evidence. So we don't know all of the details about the great Kushite empire, but logic and the evidence that we do have indicates clearly that this was a powerful Kushite kingdom which left Africa and went into these different regions of the world. But the reason why I'm trying to emphasize this is because there's a lot of things written about Kush, but they won't sound anything like what I'm saying, because the people who are researching do not consider any recent data, and they don't consider things that contradict their story. They don't even consider these things. So they would never tell us about the fact that there was an organized state long before there was Egypt, even though they have researched that themselves. The University of Chicago found out back around in the 1960s when they began to excavate that the kingdom of Tasseti was older than the first dynasty in Kemet, but yet you still won't find that in any of the accounts because of political reasons. But the Kushites had long domesticated plants, and they also domesticated animals. There's Dr. Charles Nelson and other researchers have discovered that cattle had long been domesticated in the Nile Valley, at minimum 15,000 years ago. And this is just what they found. As I said, they really have not done much research in the South, which would really give the documentation. But even with their evidence, it is clear that agriculture, development of agriculture, and the domestication of animals were two of the key things that helped to create civilization. And you don't have any high culture without those two things. And once you have them, then you begin to have the ability to contemplate the stars. You have the ability to be able to store food. Then you create the sciences. And to be able to maintain an agricultural community in the Nile Valley, people have said that Egypt or Kemet is the gift of the Nile, but it's not that easy. They had canals, dikes, they had a fantastic, highly sophisticated irrigation system, and these things took a long time to develop. And so you had to fertilize the land so that the people could eat. And in doing that, that means that you had to have some very highly organized political state. So the Kushite kingdom then was one that was created long before what they've told us. And so when the Kushites go into Kemet, then they, as I mentioned, they give them these things. They give them social organization, the religious practices, the worship of the deities, the deification of the king, circumcision, the dress, the royal crown, all these things are in the Kemet. And that is why at the earliest period of the history in Kemet is the most advanced period. It was the most advanced. There's no period where we see any development. The profound civilization comes into view ready-made. Everything's in place. The mastery of building in all kinds of stones, granite, red granite, black granite, alabaster, any kind of stone that you name. They had the mastery of it. And when modern architects look at the precision of those monuments at the beginning of the dynastic period, the first dynasty in Egypt, they tremble because of its perfection. And no amateur will ever do well going and trying to make anything out of granite, because you don't go chipping on granite. You have to have some high technology to be able to carve granite in that way, because it chips easily.
You said there were three things which contribute to our culture, and I missed what those.
The domestication of plants and the domestication of animals. Those are two things which allow you to have a highly sophisticated social organization. And so that's why that's critical, because that's what the Kushites brought wherever they went. When you see agricultural people in antiquity, these were probably Kushites. When you see nomads, they weren't Kushites. These were nomads from the north who were still in caves and destroying people up until recently. Yeah. And I'm sure we will see some more of that as well. Yeah, they are. So not only do you have this advanced culture in Kemet, the building of the pyramids, the elaborate tombs, all these things predated Kemet, and they're found south in Kush. They came from nowhere else but from the south, in the heart of the Kushite Empire, a vast empire that went all the way to the sources of the Nile. Do you know how vast this is? The Nile River, beginning here at the Mediterranean Sea, well, actually it starts here, but if we go all the way down to the sources, this is over 4,000 miles around Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. This is around the sources of the Nile. And this was all a part of the Kushite Empire, all the way up to the Mediterranean, as I said, in Saudi Arabia and far east to India. This was a part of the Kushite Empire. And so you have people in Kemet taking the Kushite Empire to places like Sumer. And one of the key things that we have to take into account, and someone who took the last 6-week seminar will know that we always have to put things, number one, as students of history, in historical context. And the first law of historiography is put it in historical perspective. So if I say put it in historical perspective, give me a context to view things. Give me some time frame to look at things. Because what we get is just Egypt in general. You can't talk about Egypt in general because you have waves and waves of invaders. You have periods where barbarians come in and they do nothing to contribute to the culture. So we know that Kushite dynasties were always the high periods. The first dynasty, you have extraordinary development. And anytime anybody, I don't care what your view is of art, sees anything made in alabaster, you have to marvel at it. Whether it's pottery, vessels, I mean, that's some of the most beautiful stoneware that you can find, is that first, second dynasty alabaster material. I mean, it is completely beautiful. It doesn't matter what stone, but alabaster just does something to you. But the first dynasty, when you have the political organization in Kemet, and I'll reinforce this with slides, is when the Kushites come from the south. They come from the south, go into Kemet, and they form the first dynasty. And they did this because the land was overrun with enemies. And people have questioned, oh, what did you say? They've asked me after I've said, or what I'm about to say, which is Europeans have been in the Nile Valley before the state in Kemet was organized. There's no doubt whatsoever about that. That is why in just about every single monument before Kemet becomes a unified country, where Upper and Lower Kemet becomes one, there are scenes of warfare. There are scenes of battle. And the one that is most often shown in books that the public will get is the Narmer palette, which I'll show. And the Narmer palette is only one palette, but you have a lot of material from a place called Heracleopolis. And everything is about defeating enemies. In museum after museum, you find bound captives. Before, there was a first dynasty. And not only are they bound captives, but they are clearly the European type. In Upper Kemet, not just in the Delta. They weren't just in this region here, but these people were south. And when the state in Kemet was organized, they pushed these barbarians to the edge of the country here. And they had to do that so that they can create high culture. And you do not get the great pyramid building. You don't get the great culture. You don't get the great tomb building. You don't get the great astronomy. You don't get the great culture. You don't get the great science until the kingdom and the civilization and culture in Kemet is made into a kingdom. And is made into a kingdom after enemies are defeated. And it was Kushites who came from the south to organize the first Kemetan dynasty. So that was a high period. The Kushites again in Dynasty 4. What happened in Dynasty 4? You have something else that happens. And you only have these great periods when Kushites come from the south. That's the only time you get a renewal of culture. That's the only time you get a cultural renaissance. If the Kushites don't come from the south and recreate and take the culture to another level, all you get is some poor imitation and decadence. And the fourth dynasty is the... No, that's a little later. But the fourth dynasty, we have what this young brother and other people know about most. One of the great wonders of the world. You get the Pyramid Age in the fourth dynasty. And why do you get the Pyramid Age? Because you have another wave of Kushites who come from the south and give our people in Kemet the knowledge of how to build pyramids. And not only did they build pyramids in Kemet, but I'll show you that they built them other places. Wherever they went, they brought agriculture, they brought the respect for women, they brought great temple building, they brought great pyramid building. And we'll look at that on the slides. In the fourth dynasty, the Kushites again bring advanced culture, high culture. Again, after that, what is the next important period? The 11th dynasty. And I say that because we want to skip some of the dynasties because they are dynasties that are being run by foreigners who claim to be pharaohs and who weren't. They just came in as invaders, took over parts of the country and called themselves king. And people have called them Egyptians or Kemetans, and they're not. So we got the Kushites again in the 11th dynasty. And I'm going to show you images of that, where Mentuhotep, also coming from the south, again puts the kingdom back in order. Because right before the 11th dynasty, you had chaos. And it was, again, Africans from the south coming to bring high culture, bringing the knowledge of what the Kushites taught them. So that was the 11th and 12th dynasty. After that, again, you have these people in the north, and then you have the Hyksos. You have the people in the north who were there as enemies, and they were enemies of the state. Believe me, they were not to be trusted. They were not to move in the country, and they were to be escorted only by the military because they were a threat to national security. This is these people in the north, and the ancestors called them, one name they called them is the Rekyet people, who they represented by birds, you remember. And the Rekyet people were always indicated by this Rekyet or lapwing bird. And the lapwing bird is always shown as in postures of subjugation. So it's sitting on its wings, meaning that it can't go anywhere, or it is pent back like this. So either you have the lapwing bird being subjugated, or you have the actual images of these people themselves, always with arms behind them because they are bound captives, and always in postures of humiliation. Always. So after the great 12th, the 11th and 12th dynasty, again you get a flowering of temple building, you get great literature, you get a great flowering of the culture. After that, you have, again, political chaos because those people in the north sided with people coming in from Western Asia. They call it the Hyksos, coming in from this region and joining with the Rekyet people to create political chaos. And the chaos is not stopped until, again, Africans do what? They come from the south and, again, recreate culture. And that's when you have the profound 18th dynasty. That's the period where you have the great queen mothers. You have great queen mothers all the way through. And incidentally, footnote, somebody thinks, there's probably one person here, who thinks that Hatshepsut was the only king or pharaoh or ruler. But you've had many going back to the second dynasty in Kemet. So you have a handful of female rulers, but that's not so much of the issue because women have a role to play. They don't have to be pharaohs in order to be treated with respect. That's an entirely different talk, but I would indicate that it was the queen mothers. It was through their line that the descent was traced. So you could not even have any legitimacy on the throne until you married, if it was your real sister symbolically, or a sister, to become pharaoh. And that's the only way it could be done because the women were important. And you see that in many respects that they were important. But nevertheless, you get Queen Amos Nefertari, who was the queen mother of the 18th dynasty. And she, again, coming from the south and always depicted as jet black. No question about her identity. That's the period when you have the great Amenhoteps, the great Thutmoses, the great, well, not so great, really, but Tutankhamun. The reason why we know about Tutankhamun is the fact that his tomb was found intact. He wasn't important other than the fact that it was his tomb that gave researchers and gave the world what a royal tomb looked like before it was plundered. Because most of the artifacts have been plundered and pillaged. And so what we got now are remains. That's what this is remains. The remains are, are powerful. So we know that there was a lot more than what we see today. But nevertheless, you have the great 18th dynasty, which came from the south. Then you have the 19th dynasty, which again was it was ruled and controlled by Africans. And again, I didn't mention it, but in all these periods, you have a concept called Winum Mesu, which means the repetition of the birth. So the original birth was the birth of the Kushite Empire. That was the birth. And, the second birth would then be the developing of the civilization in Kemet. And so the people in Kemet realized that after these periods of chaos, to get things right again, there had to be a repetition of the birth. So his brothers left us. But we'll give him a chance to get himself together. But you have a repetition of the birth during these periods, and what the ancestors were saying is that we represent the culture. We represent the Renaissance and the tradition. You have that in the 11th and 12th dynasty. You have it again in the 18th and 19th dynasty. After that, you have all kind of foreign groups who come in and they disrupt the progress of the culture. There's no temple building again. There's no great pyramid building anymore. There's no elaborate tombs anymore. The science is not developed at all. The society becomes corrupt. There's no humanity anymore. The agricultural society became one in which farmers had to carry guns, that people had to protect their women from being violated by brutes coming in from foreign lands. So, but after this period of chaos, you get the last chance that you and I had to keep the empire intact, and that was the 25th dynasty. And that's when you have the great Taharqa, Pianki, Shabaka, An-Malani, and Asfelta, and other Kushite rulers, and we'll show some slides of them. It was them who again brought the Renaissance. And it was a beautiful period, that 25th dynasty, because not only were they fighting against barbarians in the north, the Assyrians and others, but they were able to advance the culture. They were able to go back to the original time, the Winnie Mesu. And they also had another concept called the Septepi, which meant the first time. And the Winnie Mesu meant the repetition of the birth. So we want to go back to fertile times. This is similar to the concept that our brothers and sisters have in Australia, which is the concept of the dream time. That nothing can be outside of the law and the customs and the tradition of the dream time. That's the sacred time. And any violation of that, one is punished. You're punished if you do not. And you know, the Gagaju of Northern Australia, they are one of these original people who now are dying out. They're dying out because you can't pass sacred ceremonies to just anybody. You got to be initiated into the system. You got to be initiated into the sacred system. And if you are not initiated, you cannot receive this wisdom. And so the great Gagaju people are losing, you know, these things. You got a lot of elders there who are the last representatives of this wisdom that comes from the dream time. And I remember looking at one documentary where an ancestor of the Gagaju, he didn't listen. And because he didn't listen about how to correctly perform the ceremony, he was punished. And he was turned into a lizard. You know, and so they think that one of the Srill lizard is one of their relatives who did not listen. He didn't perform the ceremony right. so he became an animal. But you can't violate tradition. You can't violate the original time. So whether we go all the way to Australia or come back to the Nile Valley with the concept of Winnie Mesu, the repetition of the birth, or the Septepi, the first time, it's got to be according to tradition. And that's what the Kushites represented in the 25th dynasty. And they were the ones who brought high culture to America. They were the ones who brought the original culture to this hemisphere. And we'll show some slides. But they brought forth the profound Olmec culture. So it was with Kushite knowledge. It was with the knowledge of how to build pyramids. It was with the knowledge of the seasons. It was with the knowledge of how to orientate temples so that they have a north-south orientation. It was with that knowledge, and only with that knowledge, was the civilization in this hemisphere created. So they helped to create it. There were indigenous people there, so we don't say that they were all Kushites, but it was certainly the knowledge that the Kushites brought that helped to bring forth the Olmec culture, which we'll say more about later. But those were the periods. These were the great Kushite periods when they continued to bring culture into Kemet. The first dynasty, the fourth dynasty, the 11th dynasty, 11th and 12th, if you want to say it that way, the 18th, 19th, and the 25th. These were periods in which the Kushites were the predominant people, and it was their knowledge which predominated in Kemet. Other than that, you have periods of decline. So that's the real political history of Kemet. And after the 25th dynasty, it goes downhill. And you have nothing but imitators who take on African names, who marry African women, who worship African gods, who practice African ceremonies, but it is a clear deterioration of the culture. You see that in the literature and you see that in the art, a clear deterioration. So Kemet is an offspring. And we can look at, as I said, the biblical tradition. We look at what the Ethiopians said about Kemet, and we also can look at what the Greeks and Romans said about Kemet and its founding. But also we have the Kushites. Not only, as I said, the Kushite Empire extends east. It extends east. So if we want to talk about the African presence in Asia, we go back to Java Man and Peking Man, which are about 500,000 years old, when Africans left the Nile Valley to populate the world. But most recently, migrations to the east seems like they were around 50,000 or so before this era. And these migrations went into places like Japan, went into Southeast Asia, Thailand, and Malaysia. And these were the so-called diminutive blacks, the small stature Africans, the so-called pygmy, but we would call them Twa, fact, it might even be my height. so I claim them as relatives. And so you have them. You have these small Africans throughout the East, whether they're in India or other places, and you have accounts. You have accounts of these people going into different places. And in Southeast Asia, they're called the Sekai people, S-E-K-A-I, these small Africans. In the Philippines, they're called the Eta. In South China, we had these diminutive Africans who had left the Nile Valley, and they have died out. The last report that they were in southern China about up until the 3rd century of this era. You also have the diminutives in Taiwan, who probably disappeared about 100 years ago. You also have the original people of Japan who were called the what? The Ainu. The Ainu. This is also, and I'm going to show you a picture of an Anu in Kemet, who was a predecessor of the people in Kemet. But the same Anu people in Kemet were the Ainu in Japan and some of the other groups, like the Sekai in Southeast Asia. So these were the migrations. And it was from these migrations of Africans who left the Nile Valley that they laid a basis for the great civilizations in these different regions. And we even have, in terms of India, for example, the great Indus, and notice the name, the Indus Kush civilization. Indus Kush. You might say Indus Valley, but another name is Indus Kush. You have Indus Kush Mountains, Hindu Kush, but Kush is the name that is used because these were Kushites who went, and it's not, we may not notice it on this map, but you can get to India by sailing on the Indian Ocean or go by land, either way. And they probably went both ways because you were great shipbuilders. You were great shipbuilders, and right around Abydos, or we would say Abydos, they found 12 royal boats recently. And these boats go back to around the pre-dynastic period. So that means that you were great navigators and boat builders long before we even built pyramids that we know of. But maybe they're underneath these mounds. Maybe we can fund some researchers to investigate this so we can better put the history together. But India, as with Kemet, comes forth ready-made. Everything's in place. You have the great centers of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. And these were the centers that the great Kushites set up. They set these regions up. And even we have in terms of who these people are, there's some speculation. And it's very interesting if you read standard history books about who these people were. They'll show you a picture. They'll show you a picture of the original people and then say that we still don't know their identity. Now we know better than that. Nobody's that silly because it's clear about their racial identity. And I'll find that picture for you. But you have images of the original people, clearly African, clearly people of the Kushite tradition. And we know that because of not only these images, but the way the society was set up, but also written accounts. And one written account is Diodorus, who not only talked about the Kushites giving civilization to the people north of them in Kemet, but also going to India, to the east. And he says that, now why would he be saying this? He was a historian. He was a careful historian. Diodorus was just as careful as Herodotus in terms of him reporting these things. But the Greeks and Romans had an interest in knowing, because they don't know where they came from. One in the ice and caves don't have a knowledge of that. No conscious knowledge. There's no records. There's no oral tradition. But what has been left with them is a tradition of plundering, but not a memory of culture, not at all. But Diodorus, he wanted to know these things, so he inquired about the people in India, and according to his research, he says from Ethiopia, he, or Osiris, passed through Arabia, bordering upon the Red Sea as far as India and the remotest inhabited coasts. He built likewise many cities in India, one of which he called Nisa. I'm not sure exactly what city that is, but he's correct that they did go through Arabia. Right here, I mean, this was a part of the Kushite Empire in the south. There were some nomadic tribes in the north here in Arabia, but in the south, there were Africans in that region. And there's still Africans in the region. If we look at Yemen and the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen and Oman, we still have these original people representing Kushite culture. But Deodotus is saying that it was Osiris, from Ethiopia, who goes and creates civilization in India. And this civilization goes back, according to conservative estimates, about 3,000 years before this era. And everything is in place. They found at least over 1,000 cities. And these cities were laid out according to a plan. They didn't just build small huts and small houses wherever people wanted to. These were well-planned communities, well-planned urban centers, where the streets would be laid out in a square fashion. Just like we have modern streets today, well, the knowledge of that came from us. It came from us. You even have these plans that survive, indicating that both Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had these well-planned streets. And not only were the streets well-planned, according to how to lay out a city, so no architect is doing anything new now. They're just building on what we gave the world. That's all they're doing. But they had 2- and 3-story houses with hot and cold running water. They had toilets with a sewer system that would drain into the central sewer of the city. These were people who had excess grain because they were agriculturalists. These were not nomads. These were indigenous Africans from the Kushite Empire who survived primarily off of agriculture. That's what they survived off of. And there was a large city granary where they left surplus grain, as was the case in Kemet. Because as agriculturalists, sometimes, like I said, Kemet is not necessarily the gift of the Nile. Sometimes you might have low floods, and you did. And if you had low floods, you had to take some precautions. Even though you had an elaborate irrigation system, you still had to make sure that you had excess grain to feed the population. The same was true in India. It was the great civilizations built on the Indus River and in the Indus River Valley. So they had the grain that was stored. They had well laid out cities, the houses, several stories. All of these things were already in place, and they had a sophisticated system, spiritual system as well. There's no indication of any developmental period. You don't just come into science and knowledge all of a sudden. If you don't have a developmental period to show forth, that means that the knowledge came from elsewhere. It was a part of the Kushite tradition. And you have the great people in India who were thriving until something happened. Now, listen how illogical this is. Very illogical. But do you know some of the reasons why they've told us that the great Indus Kush tradition declined? They said that, well, maybe it was over cultivation of the land, that they depleted the land, and so the resources in the country began to dwindle because of the fact that they did not have enough food to feed the population. They said, well, maybe the Indus River caused enormous floods, which destroyed the Indus Kush civilization. But maybe it was earthquakes. And when did this take place? It depends on who you read. Somewhere between 1900 BCE, before the Christian era, or 1500. So we can say right around 15 to 1900 that this is when these things supposedly have taken place. But in the next paragraph, then they tell us that the Aryans come. That they come. And where do they come? They come from the mountains. They come from the hills. They come through a place called the Khyber Pass. And the Khyber Pass was a route in which the invaders came in the north again. And wherever you see these civilizations, you always see invaders coming from the north, from the hills, from the mountains, from Europe, from Western Europe, from Central Europe, from the mountains of Asia, and coming from north to south, pushing the indigenous Africans further and further south. That's why you had them in southern China. That's why you have them today in southern India. That's why you have our people in southern Kemet, now called Nubia, and even further south in the Sudan, and even further south now in places like Kenya. But always, Saudi Arabia, the same thing. You have them in the south because people coming from the north were barbarians. So they tell us that, well, we don't know what happened. Maybe it was floods or earthquakes, but at the same time, the same dates, they say that the Aryans came. And in the next paragraph, they talk about the Aryans being warlike people, loving warfare. This is the picture. This is just a general standard history book, which students at some of the universities are forced to use, clearly in African. But here they talk about the Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa civilization perhaps being destroyed by all these different things. They even talk about maybe it was malaria. Then they have the ascendancy of the Aryans at the same dates. And look how they describe these people. And they are talking about the Rig Veda, which was a set of religious hymns that were created by these savages. It talks about, it's supposed to be religious hymns, but it's also a political document because it talks about the Aryan subjugation of the original Kushite people in the Indus Valley. And by subjugating them, they were able to tell their story. And in telling their story, they put together the Rig Veda. The Rig Veda is primarily a Indo-European phenomena, but there are Kushite elements in it because you do see, something approaching spirituality. It means they took what the indigenous Africans had, used some of that in the Rig Veda, but they changed it. And so the original spiritual system was taken in part by these people. But anyway, the Rig Veda, and this is according to what they have written, and this is a general standard account, the Rig Veda portrays the Aryans as a group of battle-loving pastoral tribes. Their use of horses and bronze weapons in warfare gave them superiority over the natives. In brief, the Rig Veda portrays the early Aryans with their pride of conquest and delight in battle as historic folk. And they even talk about and the thing is that you found there's cemeteries in which the indigenous people were found systematically slaughtered by the Aryans, systematically murdered by the Aryans. And you would know that. You would see people, women clutching infants and so forth, but these people died in horror because the Aryans were barbarians, and the Rig Veda gives us the documentation. That's how the Indus Kush tradition was destroyed by the invaders. And that civilization, when it becomes a part of the historical record, is already made. Everything's in place. Highly developed, highly sophisticated civilization which was agricultural based. And also the goddess religion. And not only that, but you also have the caste system that has been developed. And you have the Brahmins at top, and guess who's on the bottom? The Sudra and the so-called untouchable, who were originally exclusively us. Now you have some other people, but still, that's where we are concentrated. Just like today, we have some of us who are moving up, just like those people in Walnut Creek and Clayton and Concord. We're kind of moving up a bit, so they think. But at the same time, most of us, we still in the community. So the thing is, you have anyway the caste system that was developed by these people, and it's based on race. And it was based on hatred of the indigenous Africans. And here, if you want to hear just some of it, here's, it says, let me just read just one of these maybe, to show you how unjust the system was. A Brahmin may, at the king's pleasure, interpret the law to him. He can interpret the way he wants to, but never a Sudra, that you don't have any laws. That it's not a crime to kill a Sudra or an untouchable. You know, you might have to pay a fine, but it is an unequal justice. You will pay much more if you killed a Brahmin, for example. And this is the thing, you can't spit outside, you have to walk behind people. Your shadow is even contaminating. And all these laws here were, and I don't identify with him, but these are the laws of Manu. And these laws were put together around the time of Christ or so, but he just wrote these laws down, which really excluded African participation in the society. But these were practices that had already went on. They were just committed to paper. And that's the only thing. And even, so you got these laws of Manu, you have these, and they're very racist. They're white supremacists to the core. And South Africa don't have nothing on this mindset here. They've even incorporated this racist tradition into their religious system. So the brothers and sisters are fighting against Hinduism. They say that the system itself is racist, that it's criminal, and it justifies the subjugation of their people. And even in the Rig Veda, supposedly these religious hymns, that they brag about killing the indigenous people. They brag about killing them, beating them, and burning us. And this is what they talk about. And this is how this civilization was destroyed. But originally, a Kushite colony can't be, it can't be denied. So that's a powerful civilization which the Kushites created. We have also the great civilization in Sumer. You know where Sumer's at, right? In Mesopotamia, here are the rivers, the Euphrates here and the Tigris rivers. And so this is called Mesopotamia in this region here. And the Sumerians were in the south. And the Sumerians not only were in the south, but they say that it was a fish god called Onus who brought civilization to them, coming from the Persian Gulf, coming from the south, coming from Africa, the seat of the Kushite Empire, bringing civilization to the Sumerians. They were taught the arts by, yes. The center? Oh. Well, the center of civilization would be in the Upper Nile. There's no specific site per se, but you have different parts of the kingdom, Napata, Meru, places like that, Kerma. Those were some of the great centers, and they're all in the Upper Nile in this region. But the origin of life began in this region, and the origin of civilized conduct also began in that region. So you have the first humans. So, in fact, it's three great contributions that come from Upper Kemet. And the first is the fact that humanity was born in the Great Lakes region of East Africa. That's where human life itself began, in that region. Secondly, you have Africans migrating from that region, migrating north and migrating out of the continent to this hemisphere. You got them migrating to the east and so forth. That's a great African contribution, migrating out of Africa. And the third great contribution is not only migrating, but also differentiating, so that whether we like it, the Europeans, according to all scientific data, come out of us, are complete opposite. So that they not only begin to lose the melanin, but the narrowing of the nose, the lightening of the eyes, the stringiness of the hair, and so forth. These are differentiations that took place when Africans went into Europe about 40,000 years ago and began to differentiate into the European type. That's the third contribution coming from Africa. And then the fourth great thing that happened was not only did we give birth to humanity, then migrate, and then become Europeans and so forth and create other races, but we also created high culture. And that's what we're talking about in the Kushite kingdom. There has not been enough research done to know where the original location is. In fact, its origins go so far back into prehistory that you can't even give a Stone Age date on it. And Chancellor Williams is quite correct, again, to say that at the very earliest period known to mankind, an African civilization in the areas later called the Sudan and Egypt of today were fully developed, with all the arts of civilized life already mature, its beginnings being placed so far back into the early history of the world that it is beyond the reach of man. He says the origin is so deep in antiquity that we can't even locate its beginning. That's the antiquity of African civilization coming out of the African Nile Valley. So we don't know. All we can say in general is that it was East Africa, south of Egypt. It was in Saudi Arabia, and it at least extended into India, this great Kushite empire. And I was saying a minute ago that according to Sumerian legend, they say that it was a half fish, half man that came into this region and gave them the knowledge of civilization. These were Kushites who brought civilization to the Sumerians. And not only is it in the Sumerian account, but again, it's in the biblical account, which says that Kush gave birth to Nimrod, who's the founder of civilization in that region. And Nimrod went to Shinar of the Bible of Sumer, whatever way you want to pronounce it. And again, they were directed, and what was important was the priesthood, again, a Kushite legacy. The priesthood was important, and in each city they had, we've heard about the ziggurat, but each city had these ziggurats, which were temples. They were temples, public temples for the populace. This was another Kushite legacy. It was an agricultural society. But one thing about Sumer is the fact that it never got a chance to become a powerful kingdom. It never got a chance to become a kingdom and a great civilization, as was the case in Kemet in India, because of the barbarians in the north. So the best that you had for example, in Sumer, for the most part, you had different cities that were considered states, and not a territorial state which encompassed all of the cities. But you did have powerful cities like for example. And goes back to, at least 2200 BC, somewhere in there. At least the third dynasty, which is really what is focused on, because the third dynasty in Sumer was a period when they began to unify the states into an empire. But it was very short-lived because you had a lot of different groups in Mesopotamia. And the reason why I took a few minutes to talk about the political history of Kemet is because the same rule applies to Mesopotamia. You can't simply say Mesopotamia because you have the Sumerians, the Assyrians, you have the Old Babylonians, who were the Amorites, the New Babylonians, who were the Chaldeans, you have the Persians, and all these people were in this region of the Euphrates and Tigris. And they had different regions, so none of them really had an extensive empire until later. But it was the Sumerians who had traditional Kushite law and who laid the basis for anything and all civilization that happened in that region. It was this agricultural-based society. And so they established the basic social, economic, and intellectual patterns in Mesopotamia. And you don't get the first imperialists until the Semites come, this Indo-European. And so we have the first imperialist in history is Sargon of Akkad. He comes in and he disrupts Sumerian culture. So around 2334 BC, Sargon comes in and he unifies for a very short period the so-called Mesopotamia, but he unifies it by destroying, as an imperialist, by destroying the indigenous Sumerian population. And so that didn't last long. The Sumerians were later able to regain control of their society, but you had a lot of people in the region, and they were overrun by some brutes.
What was the date that you said Sargon of Akkad, around how many years before? 2200 or 300?
2234, somewhere in there. 2231 is when he becomes the world's first known imperialist and destroys what the Sumerians were building. And the Sumerians, by the way, called themselves the Blackheads. They just weren't talking about their hair either. So they were talking about the face, the melanin content. And Ethiopia, by the way, means or Ethiopian means burnt face or black face. So seems like this may also be a tradition. And there's other evidence that clearly indicates that the people in Sumer were African. They've done excavations. There's been excavations done. And there's a place called Kish, Kush, and they found some different skulls which they measured, and they have African features. And this is at a place called Jimdet Nasser, which is by a place called Kish in Sumer. But nevertheless, the Sumerians were not able to hold off these wild roving bands. You have the Assyrians, and they were brutal. You do not get too much more brutal than the Assyrians. These were brutal people who took war, who made brutality a science. So that for them, the art of government was that of punishment. And the thing is that they were very brutal, very savage, and these were the people who destroyed, along with other groups, destroyed Sumerian culture, and they also destroyed the civilization in Kemet. And many of you will hear at Wose, this special place, or Waset, the Greeks called it Thebes. This Wose was the religious capital for years. It was where Amun was, who was apparently originally a Kushite king who was later deified in Kemet. But Amun's seat was in Waset, in Wose. And you've always had the supreme deity being worshipped along with the deity of war, because it was the warriors, it was the army which had to protect the culture from the invaders. So the deity of war is in fact the deity Mantu. So it is Mantu or Mentu who is in fact the deity who was located at Waset or Wose along with Amun. And we had fortresses. Believe me, we had many fortresses to try to keep these people out. But we also had to have a powerful military. And I'll show slides. And I should get to the slides in a minute. But these do want to indicate that usually you have the supreme deity worship, at least in Kemet, with the deity of war. Because they couldn't be, even if you lost northern Kemet, for example, you could not lose the sacred site of Waset. That was the religious capital for many centuries, for a long time, so that had to be protected. And that's where you find the vast majority of the remains today in Kemet. It's estimated that 85% of the remains in Kemet are in Waset, or Thebes today. So that's where you see the great Karnak temple, the great Luxor temple, the Valley of the Kings, Valley of the Queens, the tombs of the nobles, the Ramesseum and other places are in that region, because that was one of the ancient important sites. But the Sumerians were overrun by the Assyrians and the Persians and so forth. So that's important to know that the original inhabitants or creators of civilization were the Sumerians in that region. Also, before I say just a word about America and then show some slides, is that in Arabia, there doesn't seem to be civilization that was as old as the civilizations in Kemet and India and Sumer. And it seems like that is probably the case because another Kushite trait is that we create civilization in river valleys. And we know that that's not the case in Saudi Arabia. So it wasn't until much later that you begin to have developments of a important civilization in Arabia, the Sabian culture or the Sabian civilization, which had strong links to Ethiopia or Abyssinia at that time. But the Kushite Empire was well in decline when that happened. And again, you have the standards of circumcision and so forth, it being a Kushite colony. They had a powerful irrigation system, religious ceremonies were important, and also trade. The Kushite empires were able to maintain their wealth because of trade. So let's not think that India was isolated. But we were the great traders, traded in incense and silks, you name it, stone. It was a flourishing trade that took place. And one of the things about the Sabian culture is that it was created somewhere around 1500 or so BC. So it was later than the other ones. And you have the Kushites interacting with people that were already there that created this culture. I'm sorry, it's about 1000 BC, not 1500 BC. But about 1000 BC, you have the creation of the Sabian culture, which was just across the Red Sea. And there was constant migrations in the region. And so in the south, you had then, as you do now, original Kushites, Yemen, the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, and Oman. So that's important to know. And the last thing that we should look at too, and we'll try to reinforce this in the slides, is that I was mentioning the different high periods in the civilization in Kemet. The 25th dynasty is important. Number one, because it was the last chance we had to rule the country. Number two, it was the Kushites who left East Africa and brought high culture to America in the form of the Olmec culture. Pyramids, temples, huge stones. You don't get that until you get the Kushites who are in power again. And it was the Kushites who were concerned about unifying the whole of the Ethiopian empire. And the last chance they had was when Pianki and Shabaka and Taharka and others tried to unify this kingdom. And believe me, we can't possibly interpret the history of the Kushite empire without recognizing that these different centers were aspects of the Kushite empire. And the Kushites did have conflict with the people in Kemet, and they had conflict because they were always trying to reunite the Kushite empire. And the only difference you had was the differences of borders. These weren't anything other than that. You just had borders between the different aspects of the kingdom. And before the first dynasty in Kemet, there's no distinction whatsoever between the Kushites of Upper Nile Valley and those people in Kemet in the Lower Nile Valley. There's no distinction. Everything is similar. The pottery, social organization, the religious practices, the working in stones, everything is similar. The only time you get different development is when the first dynasty in Kemet is initiated, and at that time you then get a border between Kemet, somewhere around modern Aswan, Kemet to the north and Nubia to the south. These were the northeastern branch of the Ethiopian Empire. And with that border, you get differences. You get some variations on different themes when the first dynasty is created. But before that, there is no distinction whatsoever. None. And this suppression of truth must be challenged because the evidence is very clear. It is unmistakable that this is an ancient civilization and the evidence has been simply ignored. It has been ignored, and there's three stages. First of all, if you have conspirators, there's different stages. First stage is ignore what you're saying. We know we're past that stage because they would not be creating all of these Nubian exhibits. So they now they understand what we're saying about classical African culture. So what they're doing is that they have ignored it, they're now dismissing it. They're dismissing most of what we say. Well, these are amateur historians, and these people are not Egyptologists. And this is some fanciful view of history. But actually, it's the other way around. We deal with the sources. We deal with the data. And if we want to put the history in correct perspective, we look at the records. We look at the documents, and we look at the artifacts. We don't simply footnote our buddies, but we go to the records themselves to authenticate that which we have to say. And so now they don't necessarily ignore us, they just dismiss what we have to say. And now we're kind of in the third stage here where they're absorbing our content. So what they're doing is giving us things in Nubian Kushite exhibits because they want to absorb it into their overall framework, which takes the history out of context. But they can't do that anymore because we are moving forward. And again, so before I show the slides, I just want to say it was the Olmec culture, which can be dated somewhere around, depending on the dates, between 948 to 680 before the Christian era, the 10th to the 7th century BCE. And this was the beginning of the Olmec culture. This was around the same time, the same identical time that the Kushites are back in power in Kemet, in the 25th dynasty. And it's around the Gulf of Mexico. This is where the civilization was created. So you got great sites like Tres Zapatas and San Lorenzo and La Venta. And they found many La Venta heads, La Venta Olmec heads, which I'll show you. And these were unmistakably Kushites who brought all of this knowledge. And there's a lot of things that you could read about the Olmecs. I won't go through it here, but there should be a lot of books available on it. You might want to pick up Ivan Van Sertima's book, They Came Before Columbus, and his sequel should be out soon. The sequel to They Came Before Columbus, Part 2, the update, because the first volume was written in 1976 and there's a lot of new data since then. And you also might want to pick up the Journal of African Civilizations issue dealing with the African presence in ancient America, which has a lot of information about the powerful Olmec culture, which had direct parallels to the religious ceremonies in Kemet, direct parallels to the temple building, pyramid building, the ceremonies. Every time you see ceremonies, usually you have the priest who has on a leopard skin outfit. You have that in Kush, Kemet, and the Kushites bring that to America. So you have that. And you have many other things that have to do with the priesthood and royalty. The false beard, for example. The sacred boats. And you see a lot of sacred boats. And you also have the images of kingship, like the flail. You might see the crook and the flail. You see those among the Kushites. The Kushites bring that to the Olmec culture. And the Olmec culture is the first high culture, the first advanced civilization in this hemisphere. And the knowledge was brought by the Kushites to that region. So when they start celebrating Columbus in 1492, we take them back before Christ, and we talk about the Olmecs. So we never start at 1619, but we go back to that which could be documented in terms of when the Kushites brought high culture and high civilization to the region. So thank you, and we'll show some slides. This is the Kushite kingdom the Kushite empire that Chancellor Williams has in his book. And you can see at the top there, which is the northern part of the continent, you see northern Kemet, or he has northern Kemet. And that's called lower Kemet. There was two lands. There was upper and lower. So you can see lower at the top. And you see the next division, you see Kim, you have northern Ethiopia and upper Egypt. So what you have is lower Egypt, or we'll say Kemet because that's more correct. Lower Kemet and upper Kemet being unified into a state, to a kingdom. And that's when you get the first dynasty. And so that becomes the country of Kemet there. And you can see that line there, that represents the Nile River. See the line I'm talking about? And at that border which has the first cataract, that word there, you see Aswan. That was the border. That was the ancient border. And so again, this is the northern part of the Ethiopian Empire. Chancellor Williams is very visionary in terms of helping us to see that Kemet has to be looked at in the context of being a part of the Ethiopian Empire. Below the first cataract at Aswan, you have Nubia. Well, that's considered southern Kush, or southern Ethiopia. And so you have those two divisions, Kemet and Nubia, both part of the Ethiopian Empire. And you can see some of the You can see some of the cities, some of the cities there along the Nile. Those were some of the major centers. And the sister was asking about where's the original seat. We don't know. It goes so far back into antiquity, but you see Dongola and Kerma, Napata, Meru, Kuru, and other locations. These were important sites. And you can see that the Nile, if you follow it, it splits into the White Nile and the Blue Nile. And that's around the sources, around Uganda and Tanzania and so forth, that represents the sources of the Nile. That represents the African part of the Ethiopian Empire. So we should always look at Kemet and Nubia as parts or divisions of the empire. And this is a map that comes from I think I took this from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And here they have a map of the Nile Valley, and they're showing that white area there is ancient Nubia. And you can see where it is in relationship to the modern states, Egypt, the Sudan, and so forth. So that was a part of Nubia. But again, all of this is a part of the Kushite or the Ethiopian Empire. This is a brother. It might be hard for you to see this. This is the brother who is identified as an Anu. He represents the ancestors of those creators of high culture in Kemet. He predates the first dynasty. And this image you can find at the Oriental Institute in Chicago. And this is the Anu. This is also another picture of the brother, and they call him the man with the pug nose and long chin. And instead of saying African, they want to give him all these other names. But anyway, this is a brother from the Kushite Empire. I wanted to show you this because this is called, you see, this is a hawk here on the top. And the hawk is a representation of kingship, because hawks, they hover above. And if you look at a hawk, a lot of times you can't see the hawk because the hawk is in the suns, in the line of the sun, so you really can't see them. So they represent, somewhat like highness. But anyway, you have the hawk who is called Heru. And Heru, or so-called Horus, is represented and is associated with kingship. But what he's standing in, that here is one of the early dynastic pharaohs. His name is Ra-Neb. And that circle there that you see, the circle and looks like a basket, that's his name, Ra-Neb. And what he's standing on is a representation of a palace. That represents the royal palace, which is there at the bottom. That's what he's standing on. And you see this in the first dynasty. This is what you see. You see these shariks, as they call them, which has always associated with royalty. And this was found in the remains of Taseti. Before there was a first dynasty in Kemet, you find not only the falcon deity Heru, but you also find the shariks. You see they call this the palace facade, because that is to represent there at the bottom a palace. All these important images associated with kingship, with the divine, predate Kemet and are in the south, in Nubia, in the Kushite kingdom. This is the great horror market, so-called Sphinx. You can see at the right corner there, this is a man. Hope that you can see him in the right lower corner. But you can see he is absolutely of no consequence in this picture. He doesn't matter. This is such a vast monument. This is 66 feet of African greatness. The reason why Hor-em-Akhet is important is because he represents the original Kushites. This is a clear Ethiopian or Kushite type. And not only that, but Hor-em-Akhet, he predates the first dynasty. This monument is older than the first dynasty in Kemet. I was giving you dates from the Turin Papyrus and from the records of Manetho, saying that this civilization goes back tens of thousands of years. And there's no reason to doubt that, particularly when we know that the domestication of plants and animals had already taken place, that there had been a long tradition of recognizing the greatness of the Kushite Empire. And not only that, but looking at the geological record, around the body of Horemheb, there are ridges which indicate water erosion. So that means that this monument was built before there was large amounts of water in this region. Now the region is a desert, and it has been a desert for some thousands of years. But if you go back in the geological record, it was a very moist, humid climate there. So what that means is that this monument predated when there was a lot of water in the region. And if you ever go to this part of the continent, Giza, you will find that there's a lot of seashells on the ground because of the ocean being in that region after Horemheb was built. And there's a whole list, there's a whole array of data about the fluctuations of the river, the Nile River in Kush, or in the Nile Valley. For example, the records go back over 3 million years in terms of whether or not it was a dry or wet period in the Nile Valley. So we can reconstruct the history by looking at weather patterns. We can reconstruct the history by looking at geological data, as in this case. We can reconstruct the history by looking at pollen data. We can reconstruct the history by looking at tree ring data. We can reconstruct the history by looking at a whole range of data, oceanographic data, because that affects weather and climate. But it seems as though this was built before the last wet period. And so that might take it back, who knows, this could be a 20,000-year-old monument. And that's not a far-fetched estimate, because this is an old monument. There's nothing like Horemheb in the whole country. And this is a full-blooded Kushite. These were the people who brought knowledge to the lower Nile Valley. And this is unmistakably an African. No question whatsoever, this is one of the great Kushites who brought the knowledge of how to work in stones. This is an African. But you see the scaffolding there. Now the scaffolding is around the whole head of Horemheb. That's interesting that they are doing that. They're trying to reconstruct now the right shoulder, a piece fell off. They want to reconstruct the headdress. But if you look at, I believe it is the April 1991 edition of National Geographic, you'll see that these people have actually put together computer simulations of what Horemheb would have looked like with the beard, with the headdress in place, and with the nose. And all of the data available to reconstruct a sphinx, they've taken images from the late period. After everything is long decided, you got invaders, you have the Assyrians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, all these people coming in as invaders doing what? Imitating Africans. So the Mark Lehner, who is considered one of the experts on the Sphinx area and those monuments in that region, has written this article, and it is criminal that they have gone to these lengths to put together this phony image of what Horemheb looked like. This is the authentic Horemheb, unmistakably a Kushite African.
Is this the one that, maybe I'm not sure, that Napoleon took the nose off of?
Yes. Yeah. Napoleon is considered the first Egyptologist because he preserved a lot of things. He had a lot of respect for the culture, but he didn't have respect for the people who built the culture. And this is the great Horemheb. There's all kinds of things that they're doing to this great Kushite now. But African features, there's no doubt. But this is what National Geographic does. Suddenly everybody loses their melanin, they lose their color, they become white. And this is in a fold out. They really want us to see this. This is propaganda. And not only that, but I have seen other reconstructed images of Horemheb. I remember being in a museum in West Germany. Now it's one Germany, but then it was West Germany. And there was a nose put back on the Sphinx, which looked quite strange because it looked nothing like the rest of the face, and it looked nothing like the original Kushites who created the culture. But this is what you find in National Geographic. But again, we were saying that the original kings of Kush were deified. And so the fact that Osiris or Osar becomes the chief deity probably means that he was an original Kushite. And so you want to make sure you respect your ancestors, so you paint them as they looked. Therefore, the melanin. And also that color, Kim. The root Kim means black, but it also means completion. And Osir has to do with the whole cycle of life. So he not only is a standard for one to become in life, but also when one becomes a deceased, it is Osir who judges the conduct of the deceased. It is Osir who sits in judgment of the heart, which is weighed against the feather of truth. It is Osir. So when we see the sacred text, when we see the great pyramid text, the great coffin text, the great spiritual manuals, it's not only for the deceased, but it is for the living. And there are texts that state that. So these are manuals for those who have the ability to see, for those who have the ability to hear. This is Osir. He's a Kushite. And they, not only that, they found his tomb. They found his tomb in Abydos. So this is not mythology. This is not some fanciful notions. These are actual facts. They found his tomb. It's called the Osirian. And if you go to Abydos today, to the temple of Seti I, in back of that temple you have the tomb of Osiris. The only thing is that, it's a unique monument, which you only see a tomb looking anything similar to Osiris's tomb at the temple of the Sphinx. Right by the Sphinx there is a temple, which is now in ruins. But those are two unique examples of temple building. All of the rest of the temples were very different. I mean, in Osiris' tomb, they was using 100-ton granite blocks to build this tomb. And they used much smaller blocks for pyramids and other monuments, but not for Osiris' tomb and not for the temple of Horemheb. Because these are much more ancient monuments, representing the original Kushites. And that's the flail he has in his hand, that white emblem. This is what the Kushites bring to America. Again, that's Osir on the left. He's being embraced by Tutankhamun. This is in Tutankhamun's tomb. So either he's jet black or he's painted green, because he has to do with vegetation and so forth. Those things which have a cycle, because Osir had to do with one completing one cycle. And of course, we never believe that one dies, per se, but one simply goes on to join the ancestors. Here's Osir again, wearing that crown which the Kushite says that they gave to the people in Kemet. And here is this leopard skin outfit, what I want you to pay attention to, because this is what they also bring to America. Here again is Osir being given offerings. You see this with deities, and you see this with ancestors. You see the family, you see priests, you see daughters and sons bringing offerings. So they're bringing offerings to their recently deceased mother and father, or they bring offerings to the deity Osir, who was originally an ancestor. And so you see a lot of rituals and ceremonies in the tombs. This is an image of Amun. Amun is thought, again, to be a Kushite king, Amun. His names mean hidden. But this is an African. This is an original Kushite. And Amun is always looking like a powerful Kushite. These are images of the African Amun. This is the Temple of Karnak. This is a powerful image. These are all images of the African Amun, originally a Kushite, who was later deified in Kemet. And they've tried, this is an African who's had a facial makeover. They reduced the flesh to the nose to change his racial identity. And incidentally, you see this kind of damage on well over 90% of the statues and artifacts. Here is the Narmer palette. This is when, after you see all of the Kushites before the first dynasty, I showed you the Anu and Osir and Amun, then you have this Narmer palette. Let me show you, I wanted this one first. This is the front side of the Narmer palette. You see Narmer's the huge figure there. He's got on his crown that represents the south. This is the white crown. And whenever you see that crown, indicates that they represent the southern part of Kemet, or the upper Nile Valley, in other words. He's the king of that region. Here he is subjugating his enemies. He's got an enemy by the hair, about to knock him upside the head. And Narmer, or so-called Menes, is standing on the ground. He's standing on land. So underneath that, he's already knocked, apparently, a couple of enemies in the hail, because he's standing on ground. So anyway, he's unifying. This is Upper Kemet here, which he's unifying. When he and remember that map, yes.
In context of the pictures of the violence and the warfare and the powerful aspects given to it, and the context of the comment that Sister Soldier made in the justification of killing white people. So you might say that violence is as much a part of our tradition and mayhem and warfare against our enemies as every other part of our tradition.
Yes, I would say self-defense is definitely a part of our tradition. And it has always been, because you've had some roots in the north. If I can find this one quote, I want to quote you about the Martu people who destroyed the civilization in the Mesopotamia. Anyway, now he's conquered the south. Now Narmer, in that register with all of those images on the top, he's representing the north with the red crown. And Narmer has 5 figures in front of him, and these represent standards, or totems. They represent different districts in the empire. And to the extreme left, you have some beheaded enemies who are given brutal treatment. They were given brutal treatment, and once they are slain, then on the next register you have 2 brothers who are holding back 2 grimacing lions, showing that the kingdom has been unified, but there was still tension. But so the upper and lower Kemet now become one, and at the bottom register you have a bull, and the bull represents Narmer, and there's an enemy here who, after being subdued, then you have Narmer going into the north to subdue the enemies from the Indo-European region. And these are Indo-Europeans without a doubt. And they're given the brutal, severe treatment of beheading. And this is how Kemet becomes a dynasty. And this is why we have to really look at what happened before that, because this is how the kingdom was unified. It was unified through subjugating enemies. This is an image that you see all throughout the period. Here, this is supposed to represent a pharaoh. He's knocking an enemy over the head. This is a constant image that you see no matter what it is, on statues, on rings, on any monument that you can think of. There are enemies being subjugated because they represented a political threat throughout the whole history of Kemet, and this has not been appreciated. I can guarantee you that if you pick up most books, they'll tell you that the political chaos in Kemet was due to internal conflict of officials trying to gain power, when the real issue was that you had enemies who were disrupting the society. Kushites bring the knowledge of building pyramids. This is the step pyramid of Zakar. Take a good look at this, because the Kushites also bring this to America, the same knowledge, same architecture. This is the great Zoser, who commissioned the building of the step pyramid, built by the brother Imhotep, who was a multi-genius, and an architect, a poet, a physician. So it was in fact Zoser, this is the close-up, who commissioned Imhotep to build the step pyramid. This is a Kushite. And of course these are the wonders of the world, which are still standing. These are the great pyramids. And this is, yes.
I always feel so amazing how you stick those pictures that you seem to feel, these items feel so much like likeness in them. It seems that you can just feel them, these items, when you show them close up like that.
That's true. And you know, the opposite side of that is that in standard books about the art and architecture and Kemet say the exact opposite of what you said, but I agree with you. They say that the art was not realistic. And it's not realistic because realistic art is represented by the Greeks. So they tell us. But this is high culture. This is superior knowledge, people who built the pyramids. This is the great African Khufu, who's the pharaoh who commissioned the building of the Great Pyramid. This is a true blood. This is an African. This is one of those Kushite images. There's no question about his identity.
Is that red granite?
It's red granite. Yes, it is. This is red granite. This is the second Great Pyramid commissioned by the pharaoh Khafre. And you can imagine this beauty. At the top you have the original limestone casing, which is not there anymore. And but you do see it at the top. And this is over 400 feet of African greatness. And this represents superior knowledge, African knowledge. This is the African Khafre who commissioned the building of that pyramid. I guarantee you that half of you have seen this, but you've only seen it in profile. On the top of his head is an image of the deity, the falcon Heru. And the reason why they show you a profile is because they do not want you to see the front view of this brother, because the profile looks very different, and it looks different because some conspirators have taken some very careful and tedious, they've taken some very, they've taken a lot of time to fix his nose up so that if you look at it from the side, it looks like a Indo-European nose. And they've taken hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours to doctor up statues. And if I'm not telling you this, you wouldn't notice, but you see his nostrils there? It is a principle of the art and Kemet that the nostrils would never be white like that. If you see the nostrils being white or not very clear, it means that sanding has taken place, that nose reconstruction is taking place, and you can't notice that unless you spend time looking at it. This is the brother Khafre, the African. This is one of the great masons, the great stone masons. And what you have around the pyramids is you have they just recently, and they're still excavating a city of craftsmen, a city of stonemasons, a city of scientists and blue-collar workers, not slaves, who built the pyramids. So it was a community, cooperative and collective effort that built the pyramids, and this is Baba F, from a family of royal architects. And you know, a footnote to this, the historical opponent is quite skillful. He's so skillful that most people won't notice what he's doing. At the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, they have a lot of things from Giza, around the Great Pyramid area. So this image of Baba F comes from Giza. You have upstairs in the Kemet Gallery in Boston a lot of powerful images of actual stonemasons, actual pharaohs associated with the Great Pyramid building. And you got great architects like Baba F. When I went to the museum a couple of weeks ago to look at the Nubian exhibit, which just opened, suddenly Baba F is not where he's supposed to be. And there's no reason for that, because all of the things from Giza and all of the things from the 4th dynasty, the Pyramid Age, are all together. But for some reason they took Baba F out of that gallery and put him in the hallway. And I would not have seen him if I wasn't familiar with the museum. I asked the guard, I looked around, and finally I saw him. I saw Baba F in a hallway, a corridor, all by himself with no lights. And 95% of the tourists would not see him. And he's the only statue in the whole Kemet Gallery without lights. And so they tell me that, oh yeah, well the lights went out. But we don't change the lights because we have to contract out to get people to come in and change the lights. So we have to pay for that. So we usually wait for 3 or 4 lights to go out. So that means that all the Africans who never go to the Boston Museum, but who go now to look at the Nubian exhibit, when all of that dies down and Africans go back to what they were doing, not going to that museum, when the Nubian exhibit is not as popular and new, when that is done, I mean, then the lights will still be off. By the time they put Baba F back in the lights and back where he's supposed to be, Africans won't be going to the museum anymore. This is the kinds of sophisticated tactics that the historical opponents use to make sure that we do not see images like this. And he's important. You got stuff on display that are not important. You have what's called reserve heads. A lot of time in the tombs you have reserve heads of whoever's tomb it is. And the reserve heads are not important. They're not important. We want to see images of who these people were and their families. The sacred text, all those things are important, but not reserve heads, but you got them in the middle of the floor. And of course, this is a given. Of course, you got Kushite combs, even though we don't make them today. But I wanted to show that they are very simple. We can use wood. And nobody in the world can use this comb but us. So we can use simple data to make our case that these were Africans. And I was saying that you got Kushites who, after a period of political chaos, who again do what? Come from the south and to again create high culture. This is the Kushite, Mentu Hotep I. And his name, Mentu Hotep. Mentu is the deity of war. Hotep means peace or satisfied. So after Mentu Hotep unifies Upper and Lower Kemet again and subjugates the opponent, he takes on the name Mentu Hotep. Mentu, the deity of war, is now satisfied because we again have created a Winter Mesu, the repetition of the birth. This is why he looks like he does. And it's not to say that those who are not represented black are a different race. They're not. They're just emphasizing that this is a brother who's not lost any melanin. This is Mentu Hotep. And another thing too, this is in the Cairo Museum. You can walk in that museum and a good chance that you will never see this statue. And this is one of the most important statues in the whole history. But it's off in a corner, unlabeled. There is no label. So if you don't read the Medu Neter or the hieroglyphs, you won't know who this is. You got to actually read his name to find out who this person is. And he's in a corner. So most people will never see this powerful Kushite. This is also during the same period. This is the 12th dynasty. This is Senwosret I. This is a period when Kushites, again, were elevating the culture and who had created a cultural renaissance. This is Senwosret. This is another brother coming from the south to try to save the Ethiopian or the Kushite Empire. This is Amenemhet III, true brother with locks, brother Ustadi. True locks. Here's images, Senwosret, white crown in the south. Here's the other period that I told you about, when Kushites again come from the south. This is the famous Queen T. This is the city. She's so beautiful that most people wouldn't notice that. Look at her nose. Look at the systematic sanding on the bridge of her nose. This is what they've done. But her beauty is quite evident. And the Kushites wanted to make sure that they were recreating a repetition of the birth, and they were to be depicted like their family members with the black and brown skin. This is a temple of Hatshepsut. You can see people all over the world honoring African monuments, honoring African greatness. People all over. But I want to show you the image of the Queen of Punt. I was telling you where Punt was, in Somalia, in the southern part of the country. This is the Queen with her African features. You see, this is one of the Ethiopian queens. And this is when the people of the Punt region were receiving an expedition that Hatshepsut had sent to the south. to receive some of the sacred incense, frankincense, and myrrh, and also to pay homage to their ancestors. And so the Kushites are receiving the people in Kemet. This is Setai the first. I wanted to show you this because this is now the 19th dynasty. This too, around his time, in fact, it was Setai who used the term Winam Mesu, repetition of the birth. He said, I represent the Kushite tradition. That's what I represent. And Ramses the Second, or Ramses the Great, is what he's called because of the massive building that he was engaged in, not only in the Kemet division of the empire, but also south in Nubia. This is Setai the first again. This is the next and final period that I told you about. This is the 25th dynasty, the last chance that you had to salvage the empire in Kemet. And this is Taharqa. This is the great Taharqa. So you have Pianki, Shabaka, and Taharqa, three great Nubian Kushite pharaohs who went to war against the Assyrians. And they went to war against the Assyrians to try to protect the ancient capital of Waset. That was where the religious center was. And so you had powerful Kushite armies that came from the south, and they were trying to protect Waset. But Waset was eventually destroyed by the Assyrians. This is Amalani. This is a Kushite. And Taharqa would be around 700 or so BC. This is when Taharqa reigned in Kemet. This is Amalani. This is the same general period, around 600 or so BC. And this is a huge statue of Amalani, who was a Kushite ruler. And I'm showing you these images because these were the Kushites who came to America. This is a close-up of the African. No question, he represents Kushite tradition. This is his brother, Asfelta. These images are in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. This is also a huge granite statue of a powerful Kushite ruler. Now they tell us that this was the Kushite dynasty. He doesn't look any different from any other period in which Africans were in control of their country.
You said
All of them during this time. We haven't identified the actual persons who migrated, but it was during this time because the ancient remains in Mexico have been dated to the same time. And you don't get a sudden flowering of temples and pyramids all of a sudden, unless people who had that knowledge bring it. This is one of the Ethiopian or the Kushite queens. This is in the new Nubian Gallery in Boston. These are some of these images. Now, of course, this is one of the great Olmec heads. A 10-ton head of a Kushite. And check out the Kushite helmet.
they have a nickname for that one, don't they? Joe Louis.
Joe Louis. This is a huge monument. This is a massive monument. An Olmec heads. This is the close-up. So you don't get these images until Kushites come. You don't get these images until Kushites are in power and begin to come to this hemisphere. These are powerful Kushites.
Excuse me, now what time frame, I guess, is approximately?
These heads have been dated around 800 or so BC. You give or take a couple hundred years. So it could be 614 or 680 BC. It depends. But the carbon dating is right around that time. That's the same time the Kushites are in power. This is in Mexico, current day Mexico, the eastern part. Yeah, eastern. Despite nose damage, he's clearly an Ethiopian, a Kushite. There's another image. And these are huge heads. Many of them weighing 10 tons. Too bad you couldn't see that one. This is a small head of an Olmec. This is a good image, pre-dynastic image. And they had an exhibit in LA recently at the LA County Museum, and all of the Olmec images were of deities and royal figures, and they were all African. All of them. Every image that was in the museum, or in every Olmec image was of Africans. Now, I'm showing to Hark again because I want to. This is family. This is the brother and others around his time that came. This is the Avenue of the Dead, as they call it, in Teotihuacan, an ancient Mexican site which you can still visit today. And here you have those. Remember, I was telling you about the step pyramids, where you have them all in this avenue. Here you have these pyramid-like structures, and they're the pyramid of the sun, pyramid of the moon, and so forth. This is what you have. Perhaps these were used altars that were being used. This is the pyramid of the sun in the background. But notice that they bring the knowledge of pyramids. You don't find that until this period. This is what the Kushites brought to this hemisphere. This is a used monument. Pyramid of the sun. Doesn't matter. I didn't show you purposely a lot of images from other regions because we would not have had the time, but I do want to indicate that we're trying to put the African family back together. That's what we're trying to do. This is a good image here. This is a common image that you see. And notice, brother, that the male and female are the same height, so they're not, the males are not always taller. But this is an image that is very constant and very regular, where you see the male and female together. And if you see an offspring, most likely it will be a daughter, because the daughters were highly cherished in the society. So it was the Kushites and people in the Nile Valley who brought knowledge to America, and they brought all this knowledge, but they had to protect the kingdom. So here are some of the armies. These are battalions that had to be sent forth in order to protect the family, in order to protect the high culture. So you see a lot of these wooden models of 40 armed men going into battle. And this here, and then you're going into battle, as I was mentioning, against the Assyrians, Ashurbanipal. And the Assyrians, they had later took over Mesopotamia after the Assyrians were destroyed. And I wanted to show you this, to show you that this is one of the images of the Assyrians. And these were the people who destroyed the sacred site of Wose or Waset. And I spared you today. I showed the image before. I didn't want to have you to suffer. So I didn't want to show you being taken captive by the Assyrians, because those images are there. You can see the images of us being taken captive by these people. But the Assyrians were very brutal. They brought warfare to its height in terms of a brutal science. And they would mutilate the victims. So you talk about mutilating Africans in the south in this country. Well, you had it here. People being tied up at the stake, genitals being chopped off, hands being chopped off, feet being chopped off, heads being chopped off, people being burned alive, people being mutilated and dragged through the city to show all of those who had not submitted that this will happen to you if you don't submit to the Assyrians. These people were brutal. Not only were they so brutal in terms of destroying people and cultures, but they also were destructive in terms of killing animals. This was a royal sport. So you see blood gushing out of the stomach and the lion suffering. This was a royal sport that the kings engaged in Assyria for fun. I mean, this was sport. In fact, it was even an act of worship. And here you see them pouring libation after a savage kill in front of an altar. Can you believe that? And so, anyway, these are pictures and images of the Assyrians. This is what they look like. This is just one group. In a 6-week seminar, we're going to be dealing with Diop's two cradle theory. dealing with the northern and the southern cradle. We'll look at all these groups in some detail, all of the northern groups, the Persians, the Assyrians, the Arabs, the Scythians, the Greeks, the Romans. We'll look at, in the southern hemisphere, the people in Kemet, in Kush, in Libya, in Sumer. We'll compare and contrast these two cradles in the areas of religion, and look at their mythology, their group origins, their family structure, their political organization, their economic organization. So we want to look at Diop's two-cradle theory and apply the theory to the data that we have about all of these different groups. And when the Syrians and others came in, Persians, Greeks, Romans, this is what you have. Went from pyramids to just rubble. Thank you.
In reference to Kush being the human king, and in the old Ethiopian Empire, and later in the newer Kemet Empire, he became the supreme being of the name of Amun-Ra. Does this mean that the ancients believed that God was a man, having known that Kush was a physical man at one time, and then later deified him to the supreme being?
Well, Kush was never considered a supreme being, but Amun was. So we get the name Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra was considered a supreme being. But Drusilla Houston, as I was mentioning at the start of my talk, she has a broad view, a clear view as a thinker, but we may differ with some of the details. She mentions that Amun was the same as Kush. I'm not sure if there's any documentation to support that, but we do think that she's correct in terms of Amun being a man and later being perhaps deified, because that's an African practice to later deify the kings. But the name Amun itself means hidden. We might say it's a mystery. We don't know really what the creator is, other than the expression of all that which is. So it seems that the ancestors in the name itself were indicating that one cannot know the creator in any physical way as a man per se, because they would have indicated that in the name. And when they use the name Amun, if they're using Amun as a verb, it means to hide. So they will show a man who's hiding behind a wall in order to indicate that the word Amun in English would be to hide. So they also use this term to express the concept of the creator. That the creator is hidden. It's not anything that you can put your hands on. So I think that that's what they were doing. And no, I don't think that they thought that the creator was a man, because they're just very practical. In fact, I forget the exact linguistic term. It's a real long, multisyllabic word, but the use of language itself. If we say, well, how do people learn to speak the way they do? They learn to speak the way they do from their environment. So in southern Africa, we had the click sound. Well, you have animals that you got to have those kind of sounds. And so people learn to whistle like birds, and you learn to speak because of listening to the environment as well. So, I mean, people are just very practical. So if you have an important king who is in your mythology, then you deify him, as opposed to something that's not practical within the context of your experience. So Amun-Ra was probably a king, but if Kush has been a king, we haven't been able to show that yet. I don't know if that's answers your question.
No, that's okay.
Well, we can come back to you, brother. All right. Yes.
Do you know if there's any relationship between the Buddhist monks and the Olmecs? Because I think it was a National Geographic had this mountainside where these Buddhists were all carved, and it looks just like the Olmec. And I'm just wondering, could there be a relationship there? it's where some monks dredge up and it's all of the rocks, you know, and the hills or have the carvings of these mountains. The head is supposed to be mountains. But it's just like.
I don't know any definite connections, any precise connections, other than the fact that you have basically the same people from the same river valley. And now river went to America, went west to America and east to Asia, and helped to create these original civilizations. So in terms of the direct connection, I don't know, but the general connection of the Kushites spreading this original culture seems to be quite clear in Asia. And in fact, you know, the teachings of Buddhism and all of these religions of the East, they get their beginning around Zoroastrianism, beginning around 500 or so BC, very interestingly. And that's the same time where the Persians invade Kemet and people begin to migrate. So because of that, Diop speculates that the original Buddha and others were priests of Kemet and who left and then created that particular religion. And it's plausible. It's very plausible that is specifically who Buddha is. But if that's not specifically who he is, we do know that the Kushites had already traveled to that region. Yes.
Is it still the same? I think it's a teaser that shows the part of what they so-called Ten Commandments, but actually the 147 different confections is embedded like on the wall. Is all that still there, or have they completely done away with that too?
Yeah, they've done away with those things, and they're in museums now. They're in institutes now. So you have to go to the museums and be able to read the language in order to, well, people have translated them, but they're not in their original place anymore. There's massive and major plundering that has gone on and continues to go on in the Nile Valley today. So you have, on the one hand, you have Arabs that are systematically defacing the monuments. They've been caught on videos on that. Also, you have Europeans and Arabs who are in cahoots together, and they're in cahoots to plunder the culture to the extent that there won't be anything left there in this original place. For example, the most powerful organization in this country it's really within a network of organizations. This is the American Research Center in Egypt, which works with the Oriental Institute and a whole range of museums and institutes. And under the auspices of the American Research Center, there are over 20 archaeological excavations right now that Europeans are carrying out with Arabs to violate our sacred burial ground.